very pleased today to have Ivan Torres, who will talk with us about the situation in Ukraine. This is a noisy reality production, and the title of today's talk will be Queen's Sacrifice: Assessing Ukraine's Strategic Dilemmas Against the Trump Peace Plan. Now, Ivan is the CEO and founder of Janus Project Global Analysis. He goes under the moniker on Twitter. His nom de plume is Yeomany of the West. He's a person who worked in U.S. Army Cyber Command. He played a role in designing the Army's cyber defense in-depth strategy. Um, he has also worked with the RAND Corporation and the U.S. Army Center of Military History. His expertise as an Army officer was grounded in experience executing and designing theater-level multi-brigade joint operations and leading battalion-sized combat missions. He holds degrees from the Fletcher School at Tufts University in Massachusetts, Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS, the Carter School for Peace Conflict Resolution at George Mason University in Virginia, and also the U.S. Army War College. We're very pleased to have Ivan with us today. And before I start and turn the floor over to Ivan, I just wanted to mention some of the latest news we've seen today concerning the war in Ukraine. And we have, starting at the top, we have President Zelensky talking today in a post he did on X that this week, literally hundreds of attacks have been mounted against Ukraine. 1,200 guided aerial bombs, nearly 870 attack drones, and more than 80 missiles of different types. In his comment he made, he pointed out how the Shahed drone, which is a joint production with Iran, this particular weapon system includes the use of 82,000 foreign components. Now, on other news domestically, President Trump today, in a Fox interview news discussion, talked about how basically Zelensky had, quote, been taking money out of this country under Biden like candy from a baby. President Trump said he's a smart guy. He's a tough guy. He took money out of this country under Biden like a candy from a baby, and it was so easy. And I just don't think he's grateful. We've seen throughout the week this whole issue of EU responses to this. We've talked and seen and listened to people talk about extending the nuclear umbrella within NATO. Whether NATO exists or not as a result of these events is another story, one to actually talk about and question. And finally, before I turn the floor over to Ivan, we have, for example, General Kellogg, Keith Kellogg, who is a member of the administration of Mr. Trump, uh, coming to the Council on Foreign Relations just a few days ago and basically telling the announced crowd there, and they, of course, at the council in Washington, D.C., obviously they reacted to that with I understand, a collective gasp. Um, Very candidly, General Kellogg says they brought this on themselves, the Ukrainians. I think the best way I can describe, he's referring, of course, to what happened in the meeting last week with Zelensky, Vance, and Trump. I think the best way I can describe it is sort of like hitting a mule with a 2x4 across the nose. You got their attention. It's very significant, obviously, because of the support that we give. So, we can talk about in great length all this as we will listen to Ivan talk about this. And it's a great, great pleasure to have Ivan talk to us today about this issue. So, Ivan, I turn the floor over to you.
Well, thank you, Jim, and definitely thank you for inviting me to come here today, speak on this extremely important uh, topic, series of events, of course, that's one been unfolding the past 10 years, and of course we can argue further back, but definitely all the changes that have been occurring over the past several weeks that are definitely a sea change, I think, for Ukraine, for Europe, and for us as well as Russia, and moving forward, going through the rest of this year and into the next. Today, the title of our presentation is Queen Sacrifice, and that's a very deliberate choice on my part. So, just real quick, for those of you who may not be chess aficionados, and for those who are, apologies for maybe describing a queen sacrifice in this manner or too too reductionist. But in essence, what a queen sacrifice is a player will intentionally sacrifice, of course, their most valuable piece on the board, which is their queen. But they do it in such a way that is subtle, and typically their opponent does not quite realize the sacrifice until it is essentially too late, and that they have got them in a series of perpetual checks. And of course, these checks will only lead to one place, which is checkmate. But in order to get to this to this type of, either playing a long game or short game, it's very risky. You have to, in essence, sacrifice something of great importance to you. In this case, in chess, it's being your queen. However, in our reality, it could be something of much more greater value, especially when we have lives and the balance of nations to contend with. And I think it is somewhat fitting, especially in the events of the past 3-4 weeks since mid February. That's essentially what all the major stakeholders in Ukraine are currently positioning, how they're positioning themselves on the board, is for making a sacrifice to get what each of them feels in turn will be that series of winning moves. But of course, you're playing against a series of players, so it could get very it could get out of control very quick. So what I'm going to do is just go through. So I have quite a few charts to go through. I'm going to start kind of big at the strategic level, move through the operational down to the tactical, and then come back to zoom back out to the geopolitical. I'm going to move through them quickly because I want to get to questions and answers and into the discussion period, and then come back, and we could come back and use these charts to talk off of. But here I'm just going to use them as a very quick scene setter for us. Second. Okay, so just to start off with, where are we? Where are we at the beginning of 2025, and what really occurred throughout 2024 throughout the Ukrainian theater of military action? So that's a direct term that essentially the Russians and Ukrainians use to describe how we would label it, the theater of operation. So here is a map that was published by Censor.net. They are a Ukrainian news outlet, and of course, like most Ukrainian news outlets, following very closely daily the events on the ground. So this was their wrap up of 2024. I had a couple of layers here just for us to talk off of. So as you can see, so there was a big change in 2024 compared to 2023. For those that have whether been following or only maybe kind of tangentially listening to what's been going on in Ukraine, 2023 was a year of that was really static. There wasn't necessarily a stalemate, but it was very static. There wasn't too much movement going along up and down the strategic front from Kherson all the way back up to the Kharkiv area. As is primarily due to both sides. One, for the Russians, reconstituting after how events ended in 2022, and of course, Ukraine was preparing for the counteroffensive, which they conducted throughout the summer, ended early fall, which at that time the Russians were able to wrestle the initiative from the Ukrainians, and they've essentially kept it ever since. But 4 big areas over the past year where operations have been focused in on. So going from north to south, of course, the very north there, you have the Suja area in Kursk. That's the Kursk salient. at its maximum extent, the Ukrainians were able to seize about 602 square kilometers of the Kursk Oblast. But of course, it is reduced since then. And over the past 24, 48 hours, there's been some rapid developments, definitely not in Ukrainians' favor, that we could get to here shortly. But then continuing moving south, in May of 2024, the Russians opened up back a new frontage north of Kharkiv. I'll get into that in a little bit here of why that was significant. Although it did not make too much headroom, but it still had some pretty enduring strategic effects. And then, of course, we moved to the main area, which is the eastern Ukraine in the Donbass region. We're pretty much in the north, in the Luhansk Oblast, in the Kupiansk area, in the Liman area. The 1st Guards Tank Army and the 20th Guards Combined Arms Army have been the focus of Russian operations there, trying to extend the line forward to the Oskil River. This is looking potentially to be, well, at least one of the minimum lines the Russians want for a potential new international border. And of course, further south, which has been the main effort throughout definitely the second half of 2024, after the fall of Avdiivka, north of Donetsk. Earlier in the year, the push out west toward Pokrovsk, and that's currently ongoing. So as total, as you see there on the left-hand side of the chart, the net total of ground that the Ukrainians have secured over the course of the past 12 months or so, and then what the Russians have secured. I'll make a comment a little bit as we go on about the metrics that we're using to track progress on the ground against maybe some other metrics that or context that we should be using to understand those metrics. So just real quickly, when we're looking at the air war, these next couple of charts will address that. So this is looking at the Russian air campaign for the totality of 2024. And we see 3 distinct periods where activity was the highest, that the Russians were really concentrating on critical Ukrainian critical infrastructure, as indicated there at the top, which indicates, of course, then that is still the strategic priority for Russian air operations. It hasn't been toward anything else. It's still trying to get at to degrade the Ukrainians' energy infrastructure. However, over the course of the year, the Ukrainians have been doing a fairly good job of repairing what they can repair after damage is done, and then with a few initiatives that they have been engaging in with various European countries to make up for the losses of some substations and other plants that they couldn't quite get back up and running, which means that potentially looking into 2025, we might see a shift in what the emphasis is for a strategic Russian air operations, considering that they may have, I stress, have gotten just about as much as they can out of targeting critical infrastructure. That doesn't mean that they're going to stop, but a lot of the improvements that the Ukrainians have made, especially in air defense, and their ability to target incoming both drones and strategic missiles, have really degraded the Russian ability to have really detrimental negative effects like they did, say, in late 2022 and 2023. And this just gives just a quick snapshot period in time, of course, of what has been a shift toward a larger employment of various different types of drones. Key takeaway here, as well as to the greater employment of air-launched cruise missiles, but particularly with the Shaheeds, and then of course the Russian variants of those. We have been seeing about 60 to 80 of those employed per week at very least. Of course, as you see there's been periods of time, especially toward the end of the year, when it was more than that, but that's been the average. And they remain pretty effective in where they can saturate a certain area to overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses. So that way they still break through and they can still have the effects that they want. But as I just mentioned, those effects that seem to be somewhat, at least for the moment, and for potentially the near future, not being as effective when it comes to the impact on damage to critical infrastructure as it has been in the past. And then just lastly, switching over to what the Ukrainians have been doing, of course, they continue to step up and intensify their own strategic air campaign, trying to get as deep as they can within Russia, targeting various different sets of infrastructure, everything from command posts, supply depots, arsenals, oil refineries, and their ability then to still utilize their energy leverages that they've been able to somewhat maintain as still a lifeline, bringing in revenue, keeping the economy going under its current inflation rates and under strain that it is experiencing, but at least as a source of revenue long term. But definitely we see here there on the chart on the left, the impact though that Ukrainian drone strikes have been having on oil refinement, plus also to shipments, damage reports, and the ability actually to move out that refined oil to markets overseas. Just real briefly, so 2024, about the Black Sea, 2024, the Black Sea kind of took the ultimate backseat when compared to everything that's happening in the air and on the ground, but it still has remained a very active theater. One of the good news stories for Ukraine is that they've been able to secure and even the existing corridors for grain shipments coming out of Odessa, as well as creating a new one that they were able to better protect that hugged the west coast shoreline in Romania and Bulgaria down to the Bosporus Straits. But to keep that flow of grain going out and that revenue coming in, as well as a secure route for other supplies and other commerce, particularly military aid that was coming in through the ports in Odessa. Being able to maintain that while doing all that they can to degrade Russian capability, especially strategic strike coming out of Crimea. So where does this leave us? So the other part of the title of today's presentation was strategic dilemmas, and again, and especially those balanced against what Trump is how he's approaching the war in Ukraine. So what is the top strategic dilemma that both Ukraine and Russia are facing as we move deeper into 2025? In the end, it's how now, after 3 years, after both sides are obviously exhausted, but they're not broken, do they balance the goals that they have, their war aims, against being able to off ramp before and terminate the war before they are unable to, right? Before they pass that along, that capability and possibility to their opponent. And although currently, and of course this has been accelerated a little bit in the past few weeks, and that's definitely an understatement, I would say, that the trajectory of military actions favors Russia achieving their war aims. Ukraine still has plenty of cards to play and employ to where they can, if employed in a timely fashion, in an effective manner, be able to affect events specifically in eastern Ukraine the way that they want to and the way that they need to. So I'm going to highlight just a couple of negative trends and positive trends on both sides. The number one negative trend for Ukraine, you hear a lot about the manpower shortage, which is detrimental and it's something that immediately needs to be addressed. But the command structure, the organizational challenges that Ukraine has been facing over the past 3 years is really what's at the top. Now, since the change in commanders for the Ukrainian Ground Forces Command, they've been making some good strides to improve that. But there's still a long way to go to actually get that really in place and effective out in the field. Their number one positive trend is their continued innovation in electric warfare countermeasures, as well as UAV innovation. Not just when it comes to long range strike or support for, in essence, close air support and or a form of indirect support. When really you think about how they're really employing the FPVs to ground troops, but even greater integration for combined arms, either defense and or assault in these various operations. So that continued ability to produce domestically, as well as to integrate drones and or other unmanned systems, AI-enabled systems, and human machine teams. Now, for the Russians, they also have their number one negative trend is manpower. They've been able to maintain it. This is true, but of course, this year is more than likely going to see them start to really feel the pinch as far as being able to maintain those recruitment and mobilization rates against casualties, as so long as they continue to be the primary attacker along all the different operational directions and all the different fronts throughout the TBD. However, their number one positive trend is their command structure. Quickly after a lot of the early setbacks in 2022, they switched from a BTG slash regimental based force back to that division centric force, which meant that they could better organize, command and control in time and space various different forces on a larger scale with all the enablers you need then to get the types of breakthroughs on the ground that gets you your military goals, your military objectives better aligning with the political outcomes that you want to see. Now that's been a big learning curve for the Russians. It's not uniform across all of their operational commands, but they have definitely gotten better at it. And this is even most of Ukrainian officers and senior officers have commented on this as one of the reasons where the Ukrainians recognize how they've kind of fallen behind on this, and hence the recent large push for themselves to reorganize along similar lines. So continuing on with the dilemma, right? So we're talking about how do I get my actions, right? My military actions to produce a military solution that's going to get me to achieve my war aims. And the focus for both sides, even from the very beginning of 2022, has been on Eastern Ukraine. This is where the preponderance of both sides have had their forces in the field. In fact, the Russian invasion force, close to 50% of that force was focused solely on in Eastern Ukraine for a lot of different reasons. You see some of the bullets there on the left side. The focus has been in here in this graphic that's on the right. It looks a little messy, but that's intentional. You see the blobbed out gray area with all the different hues of purple, reds, oranges. What that is the Donbass Industrial Zone. What the Donbass Industrial Zone is to Russia, it's their industrial heartland for this entire region. Has been ever since the 1890s. What it is to Russia, the Ruhr was to Germany and to Western Europe. So this is definitely the central economic prize that both sides are looking to either seize and or retain. This is going to become instrumental in any post-war environment to contribute to the reconstruction, and even looking past the reconstruction, to be able to either one, project further into Central Asia, potentially into the Russian heartland, and or for Russia to project out westward. So then it comes down to, how do you manage the fight in the Donbass against everything else? For the Russians, the one thing that they've been doing since the more intense focus on Eastern Ukraine from summer of 2022 forward is to contain actually the war to Eastern Ukraine, and essentially to Eastern Ukraine only. So that way they could maximize their own advantages, and in an effort to overwhelm Ukraine militarily, then to get them to the table and dictate terms. For the Ukrainians, it's of course been the opposite, right? To escalate. How does Ukraine find a way to reliably wage total war? By that, I mean the Ukrainians need to be able to directly target, degrade the Russian war economy to the point where it can no longer sustain the Russian army operationally within Eastern Ukraine, which then that brings Ukraine the ability, or that places Ukraine in the most favorable position then, just as Russia wants to dictate terms, then for Ukraine then to be able to come out with the most favorable post-war settlement that they could get. But what does that mean? And so the reason why the big focus for Ukraine has been more so on the strategic side is just because of just the realities on the ground in Eastern Ukraine. There's taken the Ukrainians a little bit longer to build up the force necessary to alter the course of the war on the ground. So right now they have a limited ability. So they're trying to force the Russians into unpredictable actions that they themselves can exploit. But of course, this calls into the ability to manage multiple fronts, particularly the Donbass against Kursk or some other distant front. If Ukrainians decide to focus on another one, given the current trajectory of events in Kursk. But how do they effectively manage it when they themselves are trying to overcome some of those structural issues and organizational challenges that I mentioned a little bit earlier? So putting all this into context, so then what is the main military problem that both sides have to overcome? And that's fighting through the Donbass industrial areas. It is an extremely dense urban environment that is punctured also too by extremely restrictive terrain. And once you even get outside of the Donbass industrial area, the ground opens up, and that is definitely not conducive for troops to be operating in the open, given the saturation of the battle space with millions of drones that are out there and that can easily target essentially anything that moves. Over the past 100 years, it has been a similar military problem that various different armed forces who have fought over and fought in Ukraine have had to contend with, essentially trying to secure the most valuable piece of real estate, being the Donbass. Then you can exercise that control over either Kyiv or up towards Moscow. First you see a couple there, or the four there. At the end of the First World War, when the Central Powers managed to invade and occupy Ukraine for a time, and of course the Russian Civil War, Ukraine being the main base for that the white Russian armies in the south were using for operations against Moscow. Then of course the fighting along the Eastern Front, Second World War, and then the early phases of the current conflict in the Donbass back in 2014. 2015. In each of these conflicts, both sides, or all combatants, some of them there was more than two, not only faced the same problem, essentially had the same results: slow, plodding advances, sometimes rapid, but those rapid advances really only came when you controlled Kharkiv. Kharkiv is the key to dominating Eastern Ukraine. It is why during the initial invasion, the Russians attempted to take it, and then why that they have the force that they employed in May 2024 wasn't necessarily designed to take it. They know that was the standard line that they gave. It was more to fix Ukrainian forces, knowing the importance of this area, knowing that the Ukrainians then would deploy a good number of forces there to protect the city, again to thin out the line in the east, to find a way to make a breakthrough and penetration somewhere else along the line. But you have a similar military problem. In each case, new different technologies being used to try to solve that problem. In some cases, resulting in somewhat of a static situation for a while before those technologies help forces to adapt, and then you see a return back to maneuver, and then one side eventually gaining that upper hand. So then, looking now where we are at early 2025. So here the chart on your left pretty much shows where the lines were about a week or so ago. Now, and then over here on the far right, these have been essentially my surmised war aims for both Ukraine and Russia, and they've pretty much stayed consistent throughout the current conflict, and they still, I think, remain tied to how things started back in 2024, or excuse me, 2014. So both sides, Russia seeking that what they want is, Ukraine to be neutral, essentially to be a rump version of themselves, both politically and militarily, dependent upon Russian economic integration, and even if that integration occurred with the West, that the integration would not come with would come with Russian consent and conditions, because that's essentially what the larger war aim for the Russians are, and what Putin is really seeking to establish long term in Ukraine. And of course, Ukraine's is to retain their durable sovereignty, to restore their territorial integrity. But of course, that takes quite a bit of military force to do that. And currently, as Zelensky has recently said, Ukraine currently doesn't have that force, but they're trying to create that force. Now, of course, the ultimate question is, which we can get to here in just a bit, is their ability to do that before events overtake them and all sides move to some sort of negotiated end. So just going over each of the or two of the main strategic directions, and then some of the focus areas on each. Looking at the north, the north, after the withdrawal of the Russians from Kyiv and from the Sumy Oblast in 2022, was quiet throughout most of 2023. There was some rumblings and some indications for both sides that operations might regenerate here, and of course, August of 2024. Well, first it was in May of 2024 when the Russians reopened up the front down to Kharkiv, and then of course Ukrainians in Kursk. So just real quick, I think it's key to point out that although the Ukrainians have poured a lot of resources into Kursk, it still hasn't been so. Just like, unfortunately, with the situation in the Donbass, it still hasn't been quite enough to create a situation in which they could change the trajectory of the war on the ground, retake that strategic initiative, and then start to set the pace and the tempo of how events play out. Moving further, or moving in to Kursk. So this is what Kursk looked like. Of course, the maximum extent of what the Ukrainians were able to hold late September, early October, before the first series of Russian counterattacks. The first one was rather successful. It took the most ground back, of course. They started to stall out until the introduction of North Korean troops in mid to late November of 2024. They were really a combat multiplier for the Russians, being able to break the deadlock that existed. But Ukrainians, of course, have been holding on to Kursk. There's been a lot of controversy, not only amongst in the West, but even within the Ukrainian military itself about Kursk. Definitely, we could talk about that in the discussion portion. But right, wrong, and different. The Ukrainian High Command was trying to use the operation in Kursk, as I said, to create that type of deep strategic penetration of Russia, directly aimed to try to degrade its ability to sustain itself long term. But unfortunately, it hasn't had quite the impact that the Ukrainians were hoping to get out of it. Not like they got out of, say, the 2022 Kharkiv and Kherson counteroffensive. And then moving to the east. Again, the east is the pivotal strategic direction for the war. This is where the war is going to be won or lost, and it's definitely Russia's to lose at this point. But within the east, this is where the Russians have shown their greatest adaptation and effectiveness in transitioning back to a more division-centric force, being able to coordinate several large-scale operations and actually get some relatively meaningful breakthroughs, particularly down in southern Donetsk. And then that brings us to the critical front, the Donetsk front. It is it's going to be here, particularly moving forward this year. The area between Chasiv Yar and going and just to the west of Pokrovsk will probably be the area where the most significant actions take place, and the outcome of operations here will greatly impact going into toward the end of the year and going into 2026, just where we sit moving forward as far as the potential, again, for moving into negotiations. It's one of the reasons why in recent weeks the Ukrainians we've seen that they are conducting a rather large, a relatively large counteroffensive in scale and in time along multiple areas of this front that has been gaining or been having some good results, even against the loss of intelligence collection and sharing with the U.S. But that might, in the coming days and weeks, that might change. So it's definitely an area to look at. It's definitely the focus point that we should be concentrated on, especially for the spring and then moving into the summer season. So just real quick, a couple of pieces of tactical analysis. Of course, the big thing for 2024 was the introduction at scale of Russian glide bombs, that the PK kit being fastened to, in essence, dumb bombs, right, to give them at least some ability to get within some type of a ballpark guided on a target. It was definitely used in a sequence or added to the Russian kill chain, and was a clear sign of indication when they started to be employed against fortifications that the preparatory phase to prepare for a breakthrough on some portion of the line, which was preceded by reconnaissance and sabotage groups, as well as indirect fire. Once you started to see fabs, you were getting close then to actual ground assaults, whether they be pure infantry, sometimes mechanized. One thing that is we did see throughout, especially toward the end of 2024, was both sides starting to husband their armored forces just a little bit more for various different reasons, which we'll get into here in just a second. But here's just a small sample of just a few of the different type of fabs that are out there reported. A total out of a total of 51 strikes that were recorded. You had 51,000 strikes recorded. 44,000 hit their target or their intended area, kind of sort of enough to where you could say it was a strike, which that's 80% strike or 86% strike rate. And then the goal, of course, for this coming up year is a total of 70,000 new fabs to be produced. So just real quick about some of the adaptations that both Ukrainians and the Russians have undergone since 2022. So here, we see essentially what is the composition of your typical Ukrainian mechanized brigade. Now, back in 2022, just real quick, just kind of orient you to, because I know it's a very busy chart and you can't read it, it's really small, but you see that the brigade is actually really robust. So these brigades at full strength would be around 4,000 to 5,000 or so soldiers, with at least eight maneuver battalions, one of them being a tank battalion, the rest being a mix of either rifle battalions, mechanized infantry battalions, motorized battalions. That just denotes the types of vehicles essentially that they're on. Mechanized, for those of you who may not be aware, if it's mechanized, you're talking heavier tracked infantry fighting vehicles. You're motorized, you're typically on some sort of wheeled armored vehicle, lightly or less armored than an infantry fighting vehicle. And then if you're rifle, you have some vehicles, but they may be of even lighter armor, even of your motorized wheel. But the bottom line is that back in 2022, this brigade was about half of what you see here, right? So over the past 3 years, Ukrainians have definitely adapted, expanding out the ability of the brigade to meet the various different challenges it's now facing when it faces essentially a Russian division. The key, though, innovation that to their task organization and an organization that the Ukrainians have made, from my standpoint, is the addition that each brigade has their own drone battalion. So that's a big deal for the brigade commander then to be able to employ both reconnaissance and strike drones on his own without interference or having to request permission from a higher headquarters. Now there's some give and take in there, but it's proved very effective so far. By comparison, the Russians really don't have that. Yes, their companies, their platoons, they're like small units. They have drones, yes, they do, but they're not organized the way that the Ukrainians have organized, which is what has made the Ukrainian drones more effective at the tactical level for them as opposed to the Russians. And then just there at the bottom, you see kind of what that brigade kind of composes of, how many tanks are in it, how many different artillery pieces and so forth are in it. This is also expanded to be more tailored, to be more robust, to meet the various different tactical challenges that they have seen on the battlefield over the past several years. And of course, one of the other good adaptations, which we'll talk here a little bit more in a bit, is of course the expansion of their electronic warfare assets. So speaking of electronic warfare, that's the one thing. So where the Ukrainians have really, really done a good job of growing and integrating and expanding their drones throughout their formations, down from the lowest level to the highest. The Russians have done just a little better job with the command and control and employment of larger and as I say, more robust electronic warfare units and platforms. Now, that's not to say that Ukrainians haven't. They have some great innovations and adaptations have been doing there. But the Russians have actually created or developed, I should say, it's probably a better way to put it, a concept on how you really add EW, you add it to the fires, the reconnaissance fires complex to really shape a battle before it occurs. So that way you can maximize your potential for penetration on a battlefield that's saturated by drones. They call it the radio electronic fire battle. It's an outgrowth of the reconnaissance fire complex that was developed toward the end of the Cold War and throughout the 1990s. And so far, it's proved effective. It's been employed very successfully in the southern Donetsk regions. One of the reasons why you saw the breakthrough that you did after Avdiivka and the steady progress westward. And now they're trying to replicate that more in other sectors of the front throughout eastern Ukraine. So what does this kind of look like? So this is a very bare bones sketch that I drew based off of how Ukrainian soldiers say this works, as well as new Russian manuals, how they say it's supposed to be employed. So what you're looking at here is essentially a Russian division in the attack moving through some fields, some paddocks. The green bars there represent the tree lines, the bushes and stuff like that in between the farm fields. In the middle there you see some yellow, blue triangles. That's a fortification area. So on the other side of that we have our Ukrainian brigade. So the way the Russians kind of organize, so back to the far right of this, you have the division headquarters, has its division reserve, has all its assets it needs to, one, protect the division headquarters. That's the air defense, the artillery, the cyber, for cyber defense, and the electronic warfare and signal. But then those also have that offensive capability, right? So that signal battalion, that electronic warfare company, that cyber company is also looking forward and coordinating with the forward units, with their FPVs, with their drones, and with close air support from the Russian Air Force, then to go through a series of probes that lead to envelopment of vulnerable Ukrainian flanks in a designated sector of the front that a unit is defending. The way that the Russians approach this is you have your reconnaissance element up front with this reconnaissance drones. Then behind that, you have one or two brigade task groups or brigade tactical groups, or a regimental tactical group. Again, each with their own drones. To either flank, then you'll have the same thing. You'll have either a 3 to 4. We'll actually have one either brigade tactical group or a regimental tactical group that has 3 or 4 battalions. So each of those battalions should have about 600. They typically don't. They have at least half that, if a little bit less sometimes. So the thought process is, or the way they approach this, to actually penetrate, the Ukrainian fortifications, is you first you attack in the electromagnetic spectrum. That's the first attack. You do that, and through cyber, you identify command posts, you identify the relays, you identify the cyber defenses, the signal defenses, to neutralize those, to cause confusion in the command and control of the Ukrainian unit. Then with the reconnaissance out forward, you would identify and target the Ukrainian drones and, of course, artillery, try to neutralize those. And then that lead brigade or in a regiment would start to identify where the line is weakest. And then those on the flank, whether they're to the left or the right, will then try to envelop That's where you employ your glide bombs to try to break the hole in the breach in the fortifications that you could then exploit. And then you just end up starting to repeat the process. And if one flank attack doesn't work, you do the next one. And if that one doesn't work, then you just try to envelop again. And it's a repeated process that's done from the division level all the way down to the company level. That's how it's supposed to work. Sometimes it works that way, more or less, and other times it doesn't. That's just the template. It's had various degrees of success and failure, but it has had enough success for the Russians to continue to refine this concept and continue to employ this concept. So what does then that look like at the lowest level? So the Russians have completely changed what a what a company looks like. They call them assault companies. Back 2022, this would have been a little bit more standard. You would have had your company headquarters with a headquarters platoon. You wouldn't have had a drone platoon that had both strike and reconnaissance capability. That's new. That's a new adaptation. You would have either a pure infantry platoon, 1 to 3, or a pure tank platoon, 1 to 3, again, depending on what the unit strength is. You wouldn't have had an artillery platoon. That's a new addition. But you would have had at the last unit there at the top, which would be a heavy weapons platoon. And so each of these platoons, it just depending on the type of unit it is, more or less is about 20 to 30 people. It could be more, it could be less, but general rule of thumb, you could think of it that way. But one of the other real innovations is the creation of the infantry assault groups, which is 2 to 6, less than squads is really what they are, but plus stuff. Back to what a squad was 30, 40 years ago. Recent years, most people went down to like 8 to 12 man squads, but back up to about 15 or so. And you see there that within that, they're made up to 3 to 5 man teams. There's a command team that's where either the senior NCO or lieutenant is located with his own drone. Then he has his own forward observer. And with this forward observer is a heavy machine gun team. Then you have 2 assault teams that have one team has RPGs. The other team is where you would find your sapper, your medic, and then you would have a reserve assault team that has some light machine guns. So it's different sometimes when you hear, like in the news, that the Russians are attacking in 3-man teams. This is kind of what they're talking about. And just as kind of described just before this, how the division at that large scale kind of employs its forces. Well, the company does this too, kind of in that manner, where you have your reconnaissance and strike elements of your drones out forward to identify the location along a fortification to attack. Your armored platoon then delivers your infantry assault groups forward, and then they kind of hang back to provide that direct fire support. Then the company has its own artillery platoon that can provide some pretty good close, immediate, and direct fire support. And then you have your heavy machine guns then too, and all of this. And then if one assault doesn't work, there's more assault companies behind that, just because the Russians do have an advantage in manpower. And then that's where you kind of get the whole notion of the meat wave. It really isn't a meat wave. It's just as the Russians have always done, right? They attack in echelon, right? You have your first echelon, kind of first beat. If you think about like a wave against the beach, right? Eventually the sand on the beach or that rock is going to get worn down after having so many assaults or hits of the water just keep on, pounding on it. So it's not so much like they're just lining up and just rushing across the field. They're actually trying to assault in successive waves or successive attacks. It's just the proper way to put it. Of course, that's minus what we did see in back in the convict penal battalions that were used in that way mostly by Wagner. So then where did that all put us, right? So now, like taking this all together, kind of talked about, hey, so what's the bigger kind of strategic problem that's out there, right? So what's the operational dilemma that they're looking at? What's the military problem they're trying to overcome? How have they arrayed themselves then to create the conditions to solve that problem? Um, and again, going back to kind of what I mentioned, is like where the focus is going to be looking this summer. This is kind of what I kind of foresee potentially where the Russians and Ukrainians are going to focus their efforts. It's easy to draw lines on maps. This is by no means um, like definitive, but I think it gives an idea of what both sides are potentially thinking. Whether they could actually reach any of this in a certain period of time, given enough time, enough the proper resources and enablers, they could. But of course, as the saying goes, the enemy always has a vote. This is like we just recently have seen. The Russians were steadily moving west, but the Ukrainians have been able to pull off and execute a rather well coordinated, larger scale counterattack along various different critical sectors of the front, and kind of stem the momentum that the Russians were having. Now, the Russians were already kind of reaching a bit of culmination here toward the end of the winter. You had less and less advances per day. They were definitely moving into more reconstitution efforts. Or just recently after the fall of the other Adivka, right along Highway 15, just to the south of Pokrovsk, the 8th Guards Combined Arms Army, which was one of the spearheads for that, was pulled out from there and then redeployed to the Torres, New York area, and then also a little bit to the west. So for potential, which is surmised by the Ukrainians themselves as a potential advance up northwest up the H-32 highway toward Kramatorsk. But so just along the trajectory of how the Russians have been moving, we definitely see continued effort to continue to push out more in southern Donetsk, trying to get as close to the Oblast border as possible. Then the in around the western north in around of Pokrovsk. They're not trying to assault the city. I think at this point that's pretty obvious. They don't want to get into another backwood situation anyway. What they're trying to do is bypass the city, and then get up past it, encircle it, potentially force another large withdrawal, as they did in several different instances down in southern Donetsk, in Ugledar, and Vanilla Novoselka. So trying to reproduce that type of scenario in southern Donetsk to continue the conquest of that area, and then of course to continue to push past the Syrie Donetsk Canal, past Chasiv Yar, and past north, past Toretsk, so you could finally then move into an assault against the Slovansk and Kramatorsk urban conglomerate, which is the single strategic geographic decisive point of Donetsk. Control of that area gives whoever commands it an advantageous position to be able to retain control then of that portion of the Donbass Possessory Zone that is, of course, still within or Ukraine's control. What is now surmised is that the 20th Combined Armed Army up in the north, one of the reasons, or the recent push there, north of Liman, is in an attempt to coordinate with the operational group of forces south, which is in the Toretsk and Chasiv area, in the Bakhmut area, to coordinate with them a joint assault toward the Slovansk Kramatorsk area, just like the operational group forces center and east did down and are still doing down in southern Donetsk. And just quick here off these bullets off to the left side, kind of give these are some of the big lessons that the Russians have learned over the past year, and what they're trying now to better implement, like I said, along or within all their formations. Some are doing it better than others, but to improve their operational capability in 2025. So looking then at the rest of 2025, where does that put us? Despite I think how things have been going the past few weeks, it's clear for both sides, the Russian and Ukrainians, that that irregardless of President Trump's efforts, the war is not ending anytime soon. Both are so diametrically far from each other when it comes to how they see the post-war environment. That negotiation at this point would not be fruitful. So a lot more has to occur and has to shape on the ground for both sides then to feel that it is now finally time to sit down. And with one of those sides feeling that they have essentially achieved their aim, or as close as they're going to get to their aim, and the other one being convinced that they're not going to, and that's what will finally get both sides to the table. And there's only two people that are going to make that decision, and that's President Zelensky and um, so a few things that I think that both sides will focus in on for the remainder of this year. I'll just highlight the top ones on for each. So politically for Ukraine, as we've seen, especially in the light of it seems like it's been longer than just a week or so, but ever since the incident in the Oval Office, it's definitely reaching out to the European partners, right, for to get some type of security guarantee, preferably with a non-nuclear deterrent in a post-war environment. And then militarily, their number one thing, of course, is going to be to retain control of the unoccupied areas of the Donetsk Oblast. That's where they're going to make their largest military contribution, I think, for the year, right? To defeat the Russians there, to prevent them from securing the rest of the industrial zone. For Russia, it's going to be the need to retain their external support. There is the Russians can still sustain themselves. Their war economy is still able to support the effort. However, that's not indefinite. So the Russians need to make sure that they can continue to get the support from China, which mainly comes in forms of financial. Yes, they get other things from the Chinese too, but the top thing is there's the financial support, of course, from North Korea. That's arms and labor. The labor shortages that do exist within Russia. The North Koreans have been kind of filling those out in the Far East, as well, of course, as what they've been supplying as far as the military aid, and of course now troops on the ground. And then, of course, the support they also get from Iran too. But of course, Iran's going to have to start balancing that against, of course, what's now starting to develop or has been developing throughout the Middle East over the past several months. And then, of course, militarily for the Russians, they need to complete the conquest of Donetsk Oblast. Now, that doesn't mean they have to control every last square kilometer, but they need to control the areas that matter. So I was going back to how I think we're kind of tracking the war. You hear a lot about square kilometers gained per day, or number of tanks destroyed, and so forth. Those are all metrics, right? And they serve their purpose and to give us different indicators. But I think the thing moving forward that we need to maybe pay a little bit more attention to is where exactly are those gains being made, or equipment being lost, and then what does that mean for the ability of both sides then to create a military situation that favors them. I think that we look a little bit more at that as opposed to just the raw data that sometimes I think most people just kind of get hooked up on, and then you get some analysis that really isn't analysis, really, the whole thing of, well, at this pace, it would take the Russians 800 years to get to Poland. They're not trying to get to the Polish border. So, putting it in its proper context is all I'm saying, is that then to get that better gauge of where things are on the ground and where things potentially are headed, especially with the drumbeat. Even though there'll be resistance to it for a while, but that there's going to come a point, there's going to come an inflection point where the drumbeat for negotiations will be too loud for everybody, and then realities on the ground will match that drumbeat, and then they'll have to. Uh, so just a couple of things for here real quick. Where does this really put us now looking forward? So our lovely AI generated a photo over here to the left, I think kind of captures what many feel the mood is right now at the time, which is it, and it is that you cannot deny that there is a sea change going on. There are geopolitical earthquakes occurring, and three individuals who command at this point. I know we could argue about Russia, but that do command enough international influence, right, to drastically change what has been in place as for the past 80 some odd years. Are these three individuals, right? China, Putin, and President Trump. And definitely when we're talking about the Trump administration, they do see a totally different direction and set of strategic priorities for the United States. Namely in that they do not see Europe as our primary strategic concern. Not that it's not an interest, but it's not a concern. They want to have it to redefine and reshape our engagement, not only with Europe, but obviously with Russia. Trump has a certain worldview and a certain point that he's taking when it comes to what he feels is the future of Russian-U.S. relations and how that will impact not just Europe but also in the Asia Pacific. So along those lines, we've heard his administration being a lockstep. You see here at the bottom right of our chart, the comments that were made by the Defense Secretary Hessek during the Munich conference, and also too in his trip to NATO. There at the top, we see what the contribution has been amongst the West since January 24th, 2022, and just to illustrate the impact of when Trump, say, hey, we're stopping aid, and then on top of that, stopping intel sharing. That is just as, if not maybe more, catastrophic to the Ukrainian war effort in the near term than potentially the aid is. I mean, they do have enough to sustain them, potentially enough for when those stocks start to run low, that Europe has been able to start to fill at least enough of the gap to make it not be as detrimental. But on the intel sharing side, although Europe has capabilities, you can't deny that there are certain robust capabilities that the U.S. have that is being detrimental, let alone just some of what's been put out in the news, some of the things that the Ukrainian military has been saying that's concerning to them when it's been coming to the events surrounding the end of the intel sharing. So then I guess this is okay. So what maybe are we potentially looking at the end, right? When the guns finally fall silent. So we've heard about the creation and the deployment of some sort of potential, for lack of a better term, security force into Ukraine. There's been a lot of ink being spilled by a lot of analysts so far. Maybe what that composition would look like. So I've kind of pulled out some of the things that are kind of consensus across all those different viewpoints of what it should look like. Definitely there is, and even amongst the Europeans themselves, I think there is a sense that it wouldn't necessarily be your traditional peacekeeping force per se. Think of more in the lines of the type of implementation force we saw in Bosnia. Yes, peacekeeping, but it was a little bit different as far as its mandate and its mission. We've heard as at least 20,000, maybe as much as 50,000 troop range for such a force. There is, and this just comes, just the second bullet there under the implementation force, as I labeled it. That's just directly from the U.S. SecDef. He said, I believe it was when he was in Brussels, saying that the Europeans should be the ones that front the bill and the force structure for that security force in Ukraine post-war, and that it should have some non-European element to it too. So what does that mean? Is there some sort of UN contingent? That's that, and then how would that even be able to be worked out, given, of course, the veto power that for the deployment of such a force by Russia, by China, and who knows, maybe even the United States. But there's been a lot of suggestion that of course that the 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 mission of this force, like I said, wouldn't be necessarily keeping both sides apart from one another. Maybe the non-European part, if it was a UN force, maybe deployed along the most critical sectors. You see there in the graphic, I kind of put a UN division, quote unquote, there in the Donetsk region, right? Maybe that was the area that the Russians and Ukrainians would really need to be separated and really need to be monitored because of any trigger point for a future conflict or the conflict restarting. It would potentially be there. But the rest of that force, it's main as far as not just the insurance piece or the assurance piece, right, for security guarantee, but then also too to continue and expand upon the collective combined arms training of the Ukrainian military after the conflict, as well as continuing to improve the build out, the organizational build out of the Ukrainian military. And then of course has been suggested to that some portion of Ukraine, that the sky comes under the protection of some sort of that secured fly zone. Again, there's different ideas of what that would be or look like. The yellow area that I highlighted on the Ukrainian map there, opposite the implementation force, is the area that's of greatest concern to the Russians. They've stated, just passing talk, right? Comments by Lavrov and so on and so forth, that any force, any military force in that shaded area, Ukrainian or otherwise, would be unacceptable to Russia in a peace peace agreement. Given that from that area, of course, you could strike deep into Russia with various different long range capabilities, particularly of Moscow. So that's a great concern to them. But of course, that's a humongous area to demilitarize. So again, nowhere near a place where currently where you could get to sit down and hammer out a deal in a matter of days or weeks. And then the last thing, of course, there's been great talk about the minerals deal, or the quote unquote minerals deal. So what is the minerals deal, right? In essence, right now of course, it's not signed, right? But in essence, it's really just a framework for an agreement. There's much more that needs to be done to really define it. But what the agreement that Zelensky was going to sign, the four big things, really, the three top things here are the main points of it. And the last bullet that I have there comes directly from Trump has mentioned this. I believe Hessek has mentioned this as well as Marco Rubio. So one, the agreement, the framework is just supposed to establish a reconstruction investment fund to which the Ukrainians contribute 50% of revenue generated from the extraction of rare earths and other minerals, and then a fund controlled by the United States, and then the United States would then reinvest that fund into various different projects to further develop Ukrainian economic assets. It's still very vague, but the three individuals I mentioned before, President Trump, Secretary Rubio, and Hegseth, have all said that and as well as J.D. Vance said that the economic, that this provides economic security, which is a security guarantee, since the United States would be economically invested in Ukraine, that's good enough for a security guarantee. Um, Again, this goes into the whole the complete and total offshoring by the Trump administration, at least, of any type of security commitments, not only to Ukraine, but even to Europe as a whole. You know, his comments are well known about um, his thoughts on Article 5 and so on and so forth, if people aren't, quote unquote, paying their fair share or whatever the case might be. So it leaves a lot in limbo, and which is why, of course, we've seen the recent flurry of activity finally within Europe. A lot of big announcements coming from, of course, President Macron, from the Prime Minister of Poland, and so on and so forth, many different heads of state over to Germany and so forth, uh, of what is going to be a completely different European security environment, going forward. So I know that was long. Just to bring it back to the end, leave you with this quote with from Eschenbach from Parsifal, and I think it ties back into the concept of the Queen's sacrifice, which is, if you're out on a hunt to win the boar, you're going to have to sacrifice some hounds. And that comes into just the messy and complicated business of actual war termination, right? Can you actually get to a peace that all sides agree upon? Normally, historically, you don't. There are instances where, yeah, you can, right? It's a lot of hard work. It takes a lot of compromise and sacrifice on all sides to get to that. Um, I think what we're more likely to see is a frozen conflict emerge, not a peace treaty or peace settlement, but more of an armistice, uh, as Russia has wed to what it sees as its trajectory forward against its increased suspicions of Europe and the West, of what it perceives as potentially its time to ascend. Um, and with that, it is not going to, and this is a time for them to do it, given their long-term challenges, especially when it comes to demographics, especially when it comes to the economy, especially when it comes to internal dissidents, those that are in power at the moment, and not just Putin. It's all the other circles of oligarchs in various different industries and parts of Russian society, that this is their time, their moment. They're not going to let it pass them by. So with that, thank you for listening, and I look forward to questions. Engage the discussion. Jim, back over
All
to
right. Well, thank you so much, Ivan. It was excellent. Really very stimulating and thought-provoking. I just wanted to, I'm going to bring Alex in a minute. And for those of you who want to make comments or questions, please raise your hands and we'll get to them in turn. Um, just one quick comment and then I'll bring Alex in right away. I look at the chronology of what we've seen here so far since February when we had on to 12th, Trump and Putin had their phone call, which was treated jubilantly in Moscow because this was significant of a stark change from what had happened under President Biden. And then you had on the 12th, you had Pete Hegseth ruling out NATO membership for Ukraine, which had been dangled for a long time. His comment in Brussels was it was unrealistic for Ukraine to expect a return to its pre-2014 borders, and he insisted that any peace agreement would have to be secured by capable European and non-European troops. And on the 14th, he essentially aligns the United States uh, at Munich with the election domestically in Germany at the time by essentially speaking out in favor of Deutschland. Quite significant change in our foreign policy. Uh, then you have this unilateral approach where the United States is conducting talks in Saudi Arabia with the Russians, and it raises a question of the interaction, which we're not seeing publicly, of the whole ties with the People's Republic and Iran and China. You know, that whole détente, if you will, that China was able to achieve between those two countries prior to these events in the past few weeks. Then you have Trump basically blaming Kyiv for Moscow's invasion, which, of course, we can get into, where do you historically start this? Is it starting with NATO engagement? Is it start with the Maidan? Is it start whatever, however you take your historical causality? Or does it start on February 2022 when the Russian military invades? Then you have on the 24th, we're voting with Russia in UN resolutions, aligning ourselves distinctly apart from Europe. And then we have, of course, what happened on February 28th with Zelensky, Vance, and um, President Trump engaging as what President Trump said is great television. Then just a few days ago, we had a retreat from the fight against Russian cyber threats. On the 3rd and the 5th, we have suspension of aid and intelligence sharing to Ukraine. Uh, and then on the 7th, just 2 days ago, we have basically Trump saying he finds it easier to work with Russia than Ukraine and that Putin wants to end the war. So I guess what I wanted to just say in making those general comments, of course, is that these are, and Alex raises the question of cutting off Starlink, crippling Ukrainian intelligence. And so the backdrop to this is like, to me, there are some are arguing, of course, that they're trying to do what Nixon and Kissinger did in 1969, except, you know, differently. Of course, and the People's Republic, of course, at that point was on the verge. It had been threatened by Brezhnev with
Yeah.
nuclear war. So I don't know what they're thinking because the relationship between the People's Republic and China, Iran is, not a player at that time. Iran was an ally of ours, of course. This was before the Shah was
Correct.
overthrown in '79. So it's a very different kind of geopolitical environment to raise, and it just raises all sorts of questions. But Alex, please jump in. I just wanted to sort of throw that out. Go on, Alex. It's
Again,
up to you.
thanks again, Ivan, for a great discuss. You know, series of slides. This one. Yeah, so I want to start concretely. Obviously, well, a lot of us are looking at what's going on in Kursk now. Um, we're again at today again. The Ukrainians have fallen back, and the Russians are advancing from the north. But what seems to happen tactically is that the Russians have actually imposed kind of relatively total drone control over the supply lines, and they're essentially now that's just squeezing the Ukrainian troops on the ground. We're obviously under a lot of pressure. Um, so I wonder. And that particularly seems to be a result of the Russians using a lot of these fiber optic drones. So I wonder if you think
Yeah.
that's like a game changer. And second, there are reports that the Russians pulled off another successful pipeline operation, kind of popping up behind Ukrainian lines in Suja. Again, it's not confirmed, but if they did do that, how come the Russians keep pulling those off? Again, obviously, I think it's like 3 or 4 that they've done, in
Yeah.
the past year or so. So stop. Oh, and if the Russians do retake the Kursk, do you think they will push it to Sumy Oblast? Thanks.
Yeah. So, definitely, I think we are seeing, especially in these last 48 hours in Kursk, um, some of the results and fallout of the Ukrainians losing that intel sharing with the United States. Now, um, the friendship, like the very next day, they said that they're going to, fill the void, and many others have stepped up. But again, this goes into where there's just certain capabilities that the U.S. has that uh, were very beneficial, right? To being able to detect early warning. Now, we say we're still providing early warning, but how well and robust that is, and if that is that uniform across the front. Uh, just looking at how things have unfolded these past or since the announcement of that suspension, it is probably not. And I think we're seeing the results of it in Kursk, especially these last 24 hours. And definitely with the ability to do subterranean operations, which are hard. They're hard to do, and they're doing them because, well, if they can, there's this window now of opportunity to exploit almost the Ukrainians being blind. Maybe not totally, but they got these gaps in their visions where they don't quite know exactly how and where Russian troop formations are shifting, and without having that ability to see deep, we're seeing the results of that. You could start to mass uh, forces at critical areas. You could infiltrate at critical areas, and then rapidly overwhelm. The siege of Salem was already under pretty intense pressure, but the Ukrainians were doing a pretty good job, even though they were slowly being squeezed. It was still manageable. There was still then, and the Ukrainians is last month, if you remember, there was two instances where they were able to push back. The first instance wasn't too successful. The second one almost got, I think, the success that they were looking for to kind of give themselves a little bit of breathing room. But itself didn't quite make it. But they had that possibility. But now being that taken away from them, I think we're seeing the results of that now. It's to the point where I think they are going to be pushed out of Kursk. I think it's just a matter of time, given what the current reality is, both now on the ground and then with now these handicaps that they have to operate under. Will they? So then that gives the Russians a couple of opportunities then to reemploy that force. The easy answer is yeah, sure, cross the border and keep what Ukrainian forces there still fixed in Sumy. But does that really get the Russians something? You can still have do you need to keep everybody there, right? Do you need to keep that entire Ukrainian force there, or do you assume some risk in potentially keeping a sizable force of your own in the area to fix another sizable Ukrainian force there, but then pull some troops from Sumy and then apply them somewhere else to where you really want to make a breakthrough? I think that's probably the more likely scenario of what the Russians will do. They will continue to keep as much Ukrainian force fixed in Kharkiv and in Sumy as much as possible. Again, this goes back to just the importance of that region, and that it is a key critical area if you want to exert greater operational control and have greater operational success within eastern Ukraine. Now, if you're able to do that, that's dependent upon the action you take down there, but you can increase your ability, right, by fixing forces. So I think that's what they'll more than likely end up doing, as opposed to just returning the favor and just whole hog going into Sumy. That really doesn't get them anything. But fixing a large force there, sure, and redeploying some part of the force that they have there to another sector, absolutely, and an area that they want to push through. And there's many different areas that that force can end up going towards.
And just kind of related to that, the idea that of you trading Kursk territory for some other part of Ukraine, do you think that was ever really realistic, or that's just like pie in the sky?
So it's actually, it's been kind of interesting that hearing the I guess the debate of why the Ukrainians went in. I think it's actually pretty obvious of why they did. Part of that is that it was so the best model to look at is there's two. There's one recent one here for sorry, excuse me, for Ukraine itself, which is the Kharkiv offensive of 2022. If we remember back to that time, although yeah, aid started coming in, but what was it, man? Yeah, it was ammo, it was body armor, it was that type of stuff, right? And then what weapons platforms were coming in was just the stocks, old Soviet stocks that were still in Poland or the Czech Republic or something. Right? What really were the Ukrainians kind of screaming? They were saying, "Hey, we need more modern equipment, Bradleys, Leopards, so on." And then that's when the big debate right really started. And although there was an operational aspect, there was, of course, there is to what they wanted to achieve in Kursk, which they did, but they also achieved their strategic goal, which was to influence the West and to greenlight that type of aid, which they received, in which they outfitted and equipped brigades for the 2023 counteroffensive. But unfortunately, the 2023 offensive went the way that it went. But part of that was to get the type of aid that they needed. That was part of the messaging there. So one of the reasons for Kursk was, yes, to it. I know it's a little bit separate from what you asked, but I'll tell you in a second. But one of the main reasons was then to what was at the time that Zelensky was really asking for. That was a critical part of his victory plan that was supposed to implement or be the vehicle to really implement the 10-point peace plan, which was the ability for long-range strike into Russia, right, with HIMARS, with Storm Shadow, with all of that, to really target or to better target the Russian infrastructure, Russian war economy, and then along with that, he wanted tomahawks even deeper. Now, unfortunately, even that wasn't enough on that political side, right? To get to convince the West, convince the United States to do that, it actually took the election of Donald Trump for the Biden administration to say, yeah, to turn that on for the Ukrainians. But no, yeah. So I think that, because I mean, then this just comes from Zelensky himself. He's actually mentioned that. I think that was potentially one of the political outcomes that they were looking or hoping to retain. That again, if potentially it had changed things on the ground the way that they were hoping it would change things on the ground, and it would get access to certain platforms and weapon systems, then holding and occupying a larger chunk of Kursk could have been a pretty good, at least from Zelensky's standpoint, card to play in to have a negotiation, whether it actually would have played out that way. I mean, I'm not too sure or convinced that it would have, but at least from Zelensky himself, he felt that it was, and that was part of the reason of the calculus of why Kursk occurred. There were other operational reasons that kind of sort of bore fruit, but only for a very short window of time. I think they were hoping then that would have married up with access to or being able to employ those long range strikes and getting other long range strike assets then to, make those operational or make the most of the operational opportunities, which ended up slipping past in October.
Okay, thanks, Ivan. Mike, you want to jump in?
Yeah. First of all, great talk, Ivan. Chock full of information. The only criticism I would say is that it may have been too much information for the average person to absorb, but then we're not supposed to be average. below average, perhaps. Um, just a couple of minor comments. One, that AI generated image superimposing Trump's head where Roosevelt's was is kind of counterintuitive, if not blasphemous. As a matter of fact, the only one of the heads that made logical sense would be putting Putin's on Stalin. But and also the other minor point is that maybe not that minor. If when you may have to sacrifice a few hounds to get the boar's head, but it depends upon how you value the hounds. In other words, if they're just useful tools to get the boar's head, that's fine. But if you put any intrinsic value on the hounds themselves, then it becomes a different equation, I would say. My question, though, is my question would be, it seems that for Putin to get his ultimate war aims, or his most desired war aims, would require the damaging, if not the dissolution, of democracy in Ukraine, especially considering the opinion how Ukrainians would vote vis-a-vis Russia. So would that be a fair assessment? And the second question would be, since the United States is at the very least no longer a player here, if not a passive ally of Russia, then is it possible, taking United States support, including the intelligence support, is it possible for Ukraine to achieve a positive outcome with just the outside support of Europe, the Canada, Australia, whoever can jump in there? Is it possible for Ukraine to achieve a ultimately positive result just with their support?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So so one on the image, I think it's intentionally meant to be blasphemous, right?
I thought so.
It's saying that, hey, look, it's like, really, I mean, is this where we're at now, right? And when you look at that image, and when we recall the big three, Stalin was Stalin, but the world that created, to go so counter to that, it's ushering in something that we definitely have not seen in quite some time. So yeah, definitely, intentionally blasphemous. And I think you're absolutely right about the hounds. And in fact, we're seeing some of that with, now we're not seeing some of that. I mean, that's, I think, what Trump's doing as far as how he views the parties in the negotiation. And this was really the party of one, right? The Ukrainians. His actual view of Ukraine itself and where he sees it playing for American interests is definitely sacrificing hounds in the wrong way, to its detriment, kind of as you laid out. And I hope I'm not putting words or say that wrong. But yeah, so okay, so one, when it comes to intelligence, in the short term, it is definitely detrimental. Like I said, I think we're seeing the effect. We're seeing those effects and what it's having on the ground at the moment. Can Ukraine fill that gap with other partners, European partners? The answer is yes, and that's already coming and taking place. But we just have to, and Ukrainians are going to come to feel, right, just that, hey, there's a capability, but it's not the same robustness, right? By that I mean that where we could potentially have more coverage for longer periods of time, producing a certain level of detail. It's not that Europeans can't do that, but it may not be as deep, right, and or as expansive. Kind of if I just list it out. Sorry, I'm trying not to. I spent plenty of time in the NSA, but I'm trying not to go off on a tangent. But yes, it's possible. There's going to be a gap period where things are not going to be good from the standpoint of the impact of less intelligence on operations for Ukrainians. Um, but Ukrainians are then going to have to rely more on their own human intelligence sources, which can produce some good results. But of course, it's always when you corroborate it with other sources of intelligence, it just makes it better and more accurate. But it'll be a while, I think, for them to hit a new stride when it comes to how they're receiving, how they're analyzing, and how then they're employing what intelligence that they are able to get through a mixture of their own sources and other partners. And I'm sorry, the other question was again?
It had to do with the crippling or dissolution, the necessity for Putin.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah, Ukrainian democracy, right?
Correct. Yeah. So if in a perfect world, it's a small rump Ukrainian state that's completely under the thumb of Russia, right? So you have you go back to and that's what he was trying to do with Yushchenko. I hope I'm say getting the right president. But it that's definitely what it's preferable, right, for Ukraine in his eyes to be quote unquote neutral, to be demilitarized, and to be really integrated more so with Russia, potentially some conditionality with the West on some certain things, but I think he would prefer that. The question is he going to get that? I don't think in at least on the near term. But that's not going to stop him from in a post-war environment, of course, then switching over and trying to heavily influence the internal politics of Ukraine to get someone in Ukrainian presidency.
Yeah. Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, and again, great job.
Gary, come on, Gary.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. Very interesting. So I just want you to comment real quick. Two things to ask you about. One, real quickly, comment on what Alex was saying, his representation about Russia gaining the upper hand in the drone war. What's your perception of that? I don't have any opinion one way or another. I'm really curious what you have to say. But secondly, more importantly, is just to restate what I said amongst many of these same people are here today, 2 weeks into the war back in 22, is that I really felt that Ukraine's only chance to win this war is for it to be a very long war, unfortunately, and to basically break the will of Russia, not necessarily attritionally take them to the point where they just literally couldn't continue, but to break the will. War is a contest of wills, as Clausewitz would say, I guess. And on that theme, do you really think that Putin has a set of demands as a peace plan that actually could be implemented, that anybody would accept, or that they're really serious about peace negotiations? Or is this really his own way, pretending to be for peace negotiations and for a peace process, a peace resolution through negotiations? Is he doesn't really intend for that to actually bear fruit, but it's just a part of a psychological warfare game where he's trying to undermine the will power are the Ukrainians and their supporters in the West. So those are my two questions.
Let me just add to what Gary just said. I'd like you to amplify the argument we're seeing right now that there could have been peace in the spring of 2022.
Oh yeah,
And just to add on to what Gary said.
sure.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. So definitely. So first on the drones. So the Russians currently have an edge on your fiber optic FPVs. So, what the fiber optic allows them to do, of course, is to defeat any electronic warfare countermeasures that are being, of course, employed to, jam frequencies that would then disrupt the flight of their UAVs or their FPVs, right? So you have something that's command wire. It's by command wire. That your EW is not going to be able to defeat that. And the Russians have been employing FPVs to great effect. In fact, in the Kursk region, they've really employed to great effect along it's the HO7 highway. Well, it's the HO7 in Ukraine across the border. It's like the 38K, I think 04. I could be getting my roads wrong there, but anyway, that main road coming into Suja. For quite some time, it's been not only under how the Russians term fire control, which means that their artillery are in range of it, and can target if they have the information, can target convoys, supply convoys, or anything else along the road. But then, of course, definitely with their drones, there's a lot of footage you see of that road of Ukrainian logistics coming in, mostly at night, and the road is just littered with, of course, destroyed or other destroyed trucks and logistic vehicles that have primarily been taken out by FPVs. So, and then the Russians have also were using it to great effect in the Kursk area as part of kind of what I was explaining on how they approach breaching these fortifications. The Ukrainians spend a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of resources in building pretty good, effective fortifications in that area. But with the manpower shortage, it's been a challenge to give proper coverage in that area. The Russians have been able to exploit that, and then using more so, these command wires to punch through that, in concert with all these other, with the artillery and so on and so forth, right? The Ukrainians realize that they're behind with fiber optics. They're making a big push this year to catch up, and they hope to surpass the amount of fiber optic enabled FPVs out in the field. They've set some pretty ambitious production numbers, but they believe that they could reach them. And if we look at the trends since 2022, they might reach I believe it's 4 million, if I'm not mistaken, for this year of what they want to produce. So we could see here soon some potential parity with fiber optics, and that does give a certain asset to them on the battlefield for both to Russia and Ukraine. So we'll see how then things develop as continue to see this innovation and changes in the types of drones employed, means to counter them and so forth. And so definitely if does Putin have a peace plan? His peace plan is the subjugation of Ukraine. We've seen how he has handled previous peace negotiations, Minsk 1, Minsk 2, and everything in between, and all the way up until the full-scale invasion. They were means more so to better position himself to then extract more of what he wanted, which was, again, Ukraine to be completely, totally in his orbit, or in the orbit of Russia. as opposed to a sovereign independent actor. So yeah, which is one of the reasons why Zelensky is like unless there's security guarantees that would make the Russians think twice about restarting, moving into a third phase of this war, this conflict, then peace negotiations are meaningless. Without something else in place, because there's been plenty of off-road. He had plenty of times to off-road in the past, right from 2014 on, and each time that he did sign something and say he was committed to it, then we see a violation later, then coming back and in a sense asking for more. So I don't think he necessarily has a peace plan. He has an end state, a state that he wants to get to, that he feels positions him best. And so then going back to the Istanbul communique, May 2022, if you look at it and you read the document, which of course they say, oh well, this would be a great start, kind of like foundation to build negotiations off of. It's complete capitulation of Ukraine. It is not a peace agreement or a peace treaty. It's essentially saying Ukraine has no choice but to acquiesce to the demands of Moscow. So it's for Ukraine a non-starter. And yeah, I think that if that in those early days, Ukraine, I think themselves realized that they got to play a longer, that they were in it for a long haul, right? It was, and that currently their approach is to attrit the Russians down, not just their forces, but the Russian economy as much as they could affect it, and hoping that they could wear the Russian economy down to the point where it cannot sustain operations in the field before Ukraine itself can no longer do the same, right? So it's both sides are fighting against the clock, trying to get to their goal before that clock runs out for them.
Gary, you got more?
No. Thanks for the end. I mean, I guess I feel the idea that their long range strikes and such are going to have a huge impact is kind of an illusion. It might have some incremental benefit. I'm not saying it won't, but
yeah, right. I mean, under what they have, yeah, that's correct. But the Ukrainians have been hoping that they would have gotten more capability to have that type of effect. But right, wrong, and different. Before President Biden left office, then other European heads of state, I would say, successfully deterred themselves from providing aid quicker, faster, more at scale, and more of the type of resources and capabilities that Ukraine needed to wage that type of strategic campaign. There were decisions made, and those windows of opportunity have passed, because obviously, the Trump administration is not taking that stance, and Europe is going to take them a time, even though the will is there. It's still going to take time for them to develop to the level and scale that they would need to support to provide those resources to Ukraine to conduct something like that. By then, those would probably be over. But before they got to that of production, stock, handover, or to provide, I guess you should say.
All right, thank you, Gary. Frank.
thanks.
Frank, go on.
Hi, Ivan. Great job. Just want to make a comment about what I think is the rationale behind what Trump's administration is all about.
Mhm.
They are thinking of a Yalta 2. And That's why they're talking about Greenland and Panama and Canada. They want spheres of influence. And because of that, the way they look at the world now, which I think is realpolitik, and I think there is a rationale, is that, you look at the sphere of influence in terms of geography, economy, army, military, and yeah, not so much politics as long as there's autonomy. I mean, not autonomy, autocracy more than anything else. But the most important thing that is now new, that hasn't been there before, is AI. And that means AGI, artificial general intelligence, which is coming around the corner, possibly within the year. And whoever has that has dominance. And China and the United States are on course to getting there pretty quick together. And so Trump doesn't want war. He does not want war in any shape or form.
Right.
He wants to settle the new world order in a Yalta II, which will be completely different from what preceded. And that Yalta II will not be just 3 countries. It will probably be Modi's India as well.
Mm-hmm.
But also, if Europe can get its act together, if it can be at the table, if it gets its act together and can act as a unified sphere of influence, right? So that's where Canada fits into that, I don't know. But the point is that this war is an annoyance. And the reason why they're doing what they're doing to Ukraine is that they want, and it's up to Putin, they want Putin to collapse the Ukrainian army in a spring offensive. And I'm sure that China also wants that and will probably support more North Koreans going to augment the Russians. And the only way the Ukrainians can stop this is through a fiber optic drones, but more importantly, they've got to get autonomous drones. Now, it's possible to get autonomous drones with this AGI that's coming up. In other words, if they can get open source AGI, and there's plenty of it around, that really enables their drones to do even more damage than they're doing now, gives them the possibility to hold out. But other than that, France cannot substitute the intelligence that the United States provides. And then you've got the Five Eyes problem, that if the Five Eyes go around the United States using US intelligence collection, that's a problem too for the alliances in that respect. So it really is. It means that, like you were saying, these combined arms armies will be able to do covert assemblies of large forces, and that I think will be the problematic to the max, very problematic for the Ukrainian defense. And there's almost nothing they can really do about that themselves, other than they have maybe human and stuff like that. But it looks like Trump and Putin, and all of them, are looking to see the Ukrainian collapse. And then, as you say, they'll just have to concede just about everything, probably all the way to the Dnieper River. In which case, same deal with Taiwan. Taiwan is an irritant. And Taiwan is doing a big mistake by allowing TSMC to come over here and build factories, because it's losing its own leverage with the United States. So I think a Yalta II is on the cards, and that's going to be bad. It's going to be bad for the world. But honestly, AGI, I think, is not appreciated by everybody, just how enormously powerful it is from a military point of view, let alone anything else. It's just too easy to manipulate people. Anyway. That is the along with population, geography, and military, that is what makes a sphere of influence in the future, I would argue. So I think Ukraine's going to lose it, going to lose because of the realpolitik behind people like Musk, and I think Trump is just going along with it because he doesn't know any other way of doing it.
Right. So yeah, I definitely agree with you on the AGI piece. I was working on that when I was at RAND. So yeah, I understand I think you're spot on with that. And yeah, so when it definitely comes to intelligence, like the saying is like, just can the Europeans fill some gaps? Sure, they can fill some gaps, but compared to what the U.S. intelligence community brings to the table, that's night and day. And it will take a little bit of time for the Europeans even to really effectively catch the stride and fill what gaps they can in intelligence, which means that Ukraine is really relying on what they got as far as domestic, and we're seeing the results of that, right? It is producing results for Russia as opposed and be detrimental for Ukraine. And yeah, there is the great danger that's been brewing with the Russians getting better at large scale combat operations. I know we typically don't think about Ukraine in those terms, right? Because the story is, small assault teams and so forth. We get really fixated, I think, on a tactical level, but there is that organizational, or sorry, that operational depth that's going on that's behind that those tactical successes. And the danger has been for Ukraine is in the Russians at the combined army level getting actual army group level type synergy and coordination going to where on a large breadth of the front you can start to have more effective, relatively speaking, combined arms for the environment that exists in Ukraine, offensive action. And when definitely you change the game when it comes to intelligence, that's just even it enhances that ability. And then moving past that, then the Russians creating essentially what they created toward the end of the Second World War, which was actual effective front armies, where you have where it's one united front working in synergy with each other to get the type of breakthroughs that are going to produce or get you that solution, get you that military solution. And I think you're right in how the Trump administration has a very different view of the geopolitical order, and they are working toward creating that order. I think you're right in that try to that the goal is to avoid direct confrontation with China. They just want Ukraine, what they see as Ukraine problem to be over with, and they're willing to do whatever it takes for that to occur because they want to move on and, for lack of a better term, have this ultimate moment, right, to reshape the order. So, and that'll take us into roads saying that where regional powers are going to be starting to exercise influence and pursuing interests in a hard way, right, with hard power, like we haven't seen in our lifetime. That might be a bold, provocative statement, but I think that it's close enough to truth that'll manifest as a reality.
Right?
Yes. So just one quick question is, so you believe that my contention is that there probably will be a very large scale offensive with the next, say, spring offensive? Do you think the North Koreans will be involved in a big way?
So there is a lot of indication of that Russia is preparing for such a thing. That we will see here in the spring, definitely by the summer, more forces in the field to a scale meant to overwhelm some part of the front to get a breakthrough. if this was 6 months ago, I'd say, well, let's wait and see if they actually do that. It was a different situation, right? But now, especially against the backdrop of everything that's been happening politically and how that's been manifesting, with what we've been talking about, the reduced aid, the lack of intelligence sharing, the undermining of the Ukrainian domestic front as far as faith in their national leaders and so forth, but trying to foment dissent at the national level and so forth. I think the Ukrainian army is going to be met with some hard pressed challenges come the spring and the summer.
Last question, and I'll stop. Do you think we have people working with Putin?
I have. Well, so I'll put it this way: there's no direct evidence of it, but we all have two eyes. We can see what we see. I think we're all intelligent enough to see the sleight of hand. There is a concern, or there's a dedicated effort for amongst or within the Trump administration to be closer to Russia, because in this new world that they see Russia-U.S. relations completely totally different. They see it from more of a friendship point of view. They want to build that friendship. Now that's a tangent. I know that I definitely can go off on, but maybe that's another podcast when it comes to the history of U.S. and Russian, relations, and then potentially what might this mean, going forward for Russia, for us, and then for the West, and really the world as a whole.
Yes, very important. Obviously, I don't think any of us in here would disagree with the need to have good relations with Russia, good relations with China, good relations with Iran. I mean,
Yeah.
there should be world peace. I'm totally in favor of that.
Right.
But what does, of course, concern me is, I don't really buy into all this. When Trump decides to say, Russia, where are you? Can you, retreat? Can you save me? And back then in 2016, uh, well, there's a little more than meets the eye on that one, admittedly. And sometimes, of course, I tend to think that we're dealing with a situation where, for all I know, we're experiencing some sort of new interpretation of the Manchurian Candidate. Anyway,
Yeah.
uh, anyway, go on, Aaron.
No, thank you. Can you hear me okay,
Yep.
Ivan? Oh, great. Yeah, thanks. Once again, fantastic presentation, like always. I have a couple of quick points, and then I'll make my big question to you. I did put in the chat that there's uh, a substantial shift in the satellite and the non-line, micro-based communications, that the Europeans are stepping into that breach. And so I think in a matter of weeks to a month or two, the 8 major European, satellite providers, which, I think we over Jason Bourne intelligence, right? We like to think it's some command center and people are pushing a button and a strike happens in 15 seconds and it's a video game. The majority of multi-domain intelligence is really still coalition of forces, logistics, communications, figuring out any change or delta in that to recognize any shift of force composition. And then obviously when it comes to more advanced fires, precision air, et cetera, all those domains, then that's sort of another category. I like to kind of separate the two. I actually think that the Ukrainians in some way are going to have to get better, because there was almost more of a crutch relying on sort of the U.S. Intelligence kill chain, which also had huge limitations in targeting, right? I mean, basically 90% of potential targets were off the table. Now, because of the U.S. full-scale pullout, the Ukrainians have much more of a buffet that they can target. They have to do more of the work, take more of the risk, have to integrate further and deeper with their European partners, which is, I think, a window here this next few months. So my big question is, don't we sort of over-deterministically look at the Russians' ability to generate mass, and that fundamentally the failure design of the whole conflict is generating this 2,000 kilometer front? And that in the same way as the US went in with, eat the whole whale type strategy or vision for Iraq with, 5 to 20% of what they needed, that ultimately isn't that fundamentally the gap the Russians have. And no matter how much they re-architect their force composition from battalions to brigades to division concepts, etc., when you strip it all down and you look at raw combat power, especially maneuver combat power, the Russians are fundamentally lacking. And even when they coalesce, their ability to rally to launch is never more than 20 to 30,000, at the tip of the spear, that at the lethal end of the spear. And that just is generally not enough mass to take much more than basically hot spot small maneuver strikes, which you really don't need 20 to 30,000 to do that either. They're already doing that in this sort of go slow squad, platoon, company level. It just takes longer and it's uglier looking, but it sort of equals the same. That ultimately the Russians don't have the scale of forces that are necessary, and that if there is this quote unquote spring summer offensive, which I'm sure there will be, and actually I think we're in a pre-offensive right now, which is they're trying to test out the gaps in Ukrainian intelligence by doing these large scale fires in all directions. But in the standard Russian way they do it, they hit everything, right? They hit the civilian complex, they hit hospitals, schools, kids, you name it, which is just regenerating for the Ukrainians the will to fight, and I would argue even the Europeans pushing the accelerator to support them. That ultimately, when the Russians have sort of spent that, because the Russians do have a limit there, right? They cannot send 2,000 Iskanders; they won't have any left, right? And they'll generate only 20 a month or something. So at the end of the day, there's some moment where maybe it's 3 weeks from now, a month, that they've sort of shot everything they could shoot in fires. And I think we could agree that outside of, some thousands of civilians dead and maybe, thousands of Ukrainian fighters, that'll be the sum total, right? It's not going to be like 2 million people leave Ukraine and the army collapses because the Russians launch, 10,000 fires. So at the end of that, that's more of a terror action that seems to just be generating more European will and Ukrainian will. They're almost doing them a favor. So that's one point. The reinstantiation of their own intelligence network, which won't be as complete as the US, but it'll have a more robust target dimension that the US had limitations on. So I would argue the US was always constraining Ukraine to keep this a very limited war in the eastern provinces and the near support theater zone for the Russians. Outside of that, the targets were off. Now the Ukrainians, sorry for this background noise, that the Ukrainians targeting is now going to be, I would say, far Western Russia wide. There's no, the gloves are off when it comes to that. So that ultimately, that when the Russians launched their spring and summer offensive for 6 months, they'll take clearly another chunk, 3% of Ukraine, right? Some number like that, but they've never been able to move more than a few percentage points of the territory. And the Ukrainians just build more defense in depth. So my big question is that everybody believes there's these sort of seismic moments. They say this every 3 to 6 months, the next curve, the next turn, this is it. And ultimately the Russians don't have probably more than they probably need 3 times the mass at least, maybe more, and a higher willingness, a 10 times higher willingness to lose that mass. Right, we're talking full gun run assault. 5,000 running through a field with
Right.
the
Yeah.
knowledge that 3,000 are getting wounded and killed, and you're not picking them up and stopping. You just keep going. Old Soviet, basically the 5,000 of you go, and whether the Ukrainians artillery you or we artillery you, you're going to the other side. And the Russians clearly don't seem to have the willingness to do that, and do that repeatedly, right? Do that 50 or 100 times,
Right.
which
Right.
would lead to obviously fairly substantial losses by Russians in the hundreds of thousands to maybe low millions. So if the Russians aren't willing to do that, have this huge 2,000 kilometer front, don't have enough mass except to do these, we'll call them small to medium sized salient actions that take 6 months, take 3 to 6 months to build up, 3 to 6 months to do, and then 3 to 6 months to terminate. What really changes except this sort of nibbling, continuous nibbling at Ukraine going forward, outside of everybody thinking it's all changing and we'll sit here a year from now and no one will call bullshit on anyone else who said this 5 times, 10 times, 20 times. We pretend it starts all over again. That's just my question to you. Hopefully that made some sense.
No. Yeah, it actually makes perfect sense. And I think really when you look at it, I'd say that's probably we could say that ever since say that same thing since the start of the full-scale invasion, right? There's always been wild, to me, weird and wild assessments and estimations of whether it be 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months, whatever the case might be, or this is where the Russian army dies, or this is where the Ukrainian army dies. It's like, no, you're not really, I guess focusing or paying attention to what's going on. So I don't disagree with you there. But I think you maybe you hit the head on, I think, what is really the problem with massing, bigger than 1 or 2 reinforced divisions. Because when you look at the assault westward, right after they broke out from Avdiivka, the Avdiivka area, and first started headed toward Pokrovsk, and then they made that left, it was a left turn south, and then they started headed toward Kharkov, and it just, back in the fall. That was really, it was 2 divisions. It was the 90th, which is still kind of the spearhead, and then behind it, which although now is moved a little bit more to the front, was the 27th. Now they've both been reinforced with a couple other brigades, but that's really about the breadth of it. But I think it comes down to what you said, the will, right? There is not the will to commit anything larger than that, out of the losses that would entail, and both Ukrainians and Russians have been, like I mentioned earlier before, they've been husbanding. They've been conserving.
Yes, I got it. It's Sunday, don't worry.
They're armored platforms more, right? So you don't see tanks out that much, or other track heavy vehicles, is because they didn't want a slew of them getting whacked taken out by FPVs. They want to save them for when they do want to do something, like that. So just as where I kind of mentioned how the West kind of deterred itself from giving more sooner to Ukraine during times a year or 2 ago, where maybe, or even as recently as this past fall, where at a certain period of time where it could have made a difference. I think the same thing with the Russians. They have intentionally constrained themselves, just against the backdrop of the type of losses they took, that in the early days, right? as far as what that they lost, not just personnel, but of course the equipment, and that's not easily replaced. Although they're not, the stockpiles are not running out, but they are getting to the part of the stockpile where it's the more questionable stuff. The stuff that's going to take a little bit longer for it to become serviceable because it's been sitting out there forever, and they've already cannibalized it, so they have to cannibalize stuff even further. Which they're potentially, maybe can see that pinch between what's in the stockpile against production come the summer or fall. But yeah, that's a long way to say to think that I think your point is very valid, and I think that what's keeping the mass is not so much for me, from what I've seen, it's not necessarily much the capability, although there are questionable capabilities, right? The amount of training that new recruits or conscripts or those that are mobilized receive, definitely older in age. The average age for Russian soldiers right now, and for Ukrainian too, what is this? Is between 40 and 50. Those guys are not going to be running across fields like that, right? In the assault. So it's them not having the will, as you're saying, to employ mass on that type of level and scale. Anything more than really just, because even for Ukrainians, look at what was Kursk and Suzy. It was a division raid. I mean, that was the size and scale of it. They really couldn't push past further than what they got, because that's all they had. They only had enough to push kind of that far. So where they stopped is as far as the operational reach that they could get, because it just really wasn't that on scale. But all that said, I do think that there are certain parts of the front, as you mentioned. Yeah, hey, let's punch the salient through here. There are certain parts that, when it comes to now gearing this toward some type of negotiated settlement, there are potentially certain parts of eastern Ukraine you want to be holding when that music stops, and then you want the other side to. And I think for the Russians, that is getting as close to, if not seizing control of, and which is I myself, just a huge F. They already tried before back in 2022 and were not successful, which is the Slovansk and Kramatorsk area. That's the key part. If the Russians control that when they head to the table, because just everything else that would have to go along to control that area, right? That you get up to. I mean, in essence, you are controlling Donetsk. It's kind of like, well, who cares if you have the kind of some of the valleys and forested area and what's left of the western half? We have the important part. Could they conceivably reach that? I would say, yeah, they could, because they almost did 3 years ago. And that's what they're working back towards. But of course, the ultimate question is, would a 2 or 3 division effort, from what we've seen as they have employed, if it's employed the same way and doesn't improve any, right? Would that produce those results? Maybe not. It would be great if the gap being filled by various European powers were to be able, right, to fill that gap when it comes to intelligence support.
So one other quick follow-up,
yeah,
if you don't mind. So we always talk about ceasefires or war termination, and we tend to look at it purely from this wishes and wants political level versus the ground truth.
Right,
Aren't we looking at it backwards? That basically the Ukrainians, which I think is pretty clear now, made a substantial error starting 2 years ago without building multiple levels of lines of fortification, which they seem to be mostly starting to do now and or in the process of doing. But with it being a 2,000 kilometer line, that's a lot. And the depth that you need given the Russian tactics, that until the Ukrainians have multiple sufficient lines, which is probably at least a couple years away, that the criticality of that is that that the Russians can't penetrate that without triggering those losses that clearly they are not willing to accept politically at scale, outside of little little tapas plates of salience. That once you get to that scale, which the Russians, I would say, have almost produced on their end of fortifications, almost, probably, let's say 80% there, and the Ukrainians are probably only 20 or 30% there. That until you get to that 80-90% on both sides, that there is literally just a waste of resources, and you're not able to penetrate in any mass. That at that point you have the conditions for at least secession, large scale secession of hostilities. And because you're not going to get a DMZ UN force or this Euro force or that, or an alien Martian do-gooder force, like, it's not happening, and it wouldn't matter. 2,000 kilometers, like, you need 5 million people to monitor that, manage that, and support that, and transition through it. So it's not happening. So the only thing that can happen is they both have 2 to 5, 10 layers of incredible fortifications that makes it irrelevant for either side to try any substantial operations. You'll get assassinations and sabotage and snipers and blah, 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 which sucks for those people. I get it. But, like, you're not getting, oh, Monday morning, 4 Russian divisions popped through here. We had no idea, right? You're not getting that anymore. And so until you have that on both sides, and this has been my thesis for years, there's just not going to be a continuous war termination. And it doesn't matter what Trump does and Putin does and nuclear threats and alien landings and AGI or whatever. It's, in the end, you can't move mass to where you want to get to as an objective to then take over what you want to take over, or take back what you want to take back. And I mean, isn't it really ultimately that simple? And we just don't like talking about it because that's not sexy and it's pretty boring. And
So no, yeah, right. I agree with your assessment. Yeah. So one, the Ukrainians, and even they admitted themselves, started building fortifications way too late. And where I mentioned earlier before, they built pretty good fortifications, but then there's other fortifications in other areas where it weren't so great. And there was at times, we're still constructing fortifications as, Russians were coming up on them. So, they had to abandon those. And it's only been lately where, when I say lately, I think mid-January, where they really started focusing on stuff in Western, and this is just Western Donetsk. They haven't thought about anything in Kherson or Zaporizhia or Kharkiv. I mean, there's in the end, it still comes to who is standing on the ground, who physically controls something. And if you're not creating the conditions, in this case, building the fortifications to make that difficult to stop somebody, then the Russians will keep on doing what they're doing, because they see that, that there isn't really nothing to stop them but a few fortifications and just, the will of the Ukrainian soldier. It isn't.
Yeah, and I'll pass it to Frank, but last quick point. I did a rough calc that I said basically you need 9 engineering corps, roughly 50 engineering brigades, over about 18 to 24 months to do this in a way that makes sense, and roughly about 5,000 to 7,000 pieces of equipment. That if you sort of put that package together, which one thing is, the Europeans are built for that package, actually, probably better than we are, actually, in a lot of ways.
And that's where they could really help. This is something that just real quick, just to say that Ukraine's been building combat brigades, but where they're sorely lacking is in logistics and in engineers. And if you don't have that, you cannot sustain a fight. You cannot have operational reach. You're not going to set the conditions to really produce the type of victory that they want to have. So you're left in this situation. So no, they need that just as every bit as much as they need another 10 mechanized brigades. They really need do 20 engineering and just.
All right, thank you, Aaron. As I bring Frank on, Frank, just unmute. What interests me also is your take, Ivan, on these questions of nuclear escalation that we've seen in the past couple of years. I listened recently to a discussion with Christian Amanpour and another person who'd been on the policy planning staff of the State Department during the Biden administration. And one thing he mentioned, which I found fascinating, I think we've talked about it before with some of the people on this phone call, is that they perceived that there were instances where they had a 50% chance of escalation as a result of the saber rattling by Putin. And I, for one, have always argued that Putin may have that as part of his bag of tricks, but it was clear in the conventional military buildup that we've seen since 2022 that they were seeking to achieve conventional dominance as opposed to using tactical nuclear weapons, which all of us are well familiar with the Soviet military doctrine, how that's introduced. But I just wanted you to comment on that, and then also go on, Frank.
You want me to?
Yeah, go on, Frank, please.
Okay. Well, actually, that's an excellent point, and that when I said that the spheres of influence, it's also determined. When I say militarily, it's also by nukes. That's why Russia is at the table, because economically, it's a joke. But because it has 3,000 plus nukes, it's absolutely got a setting at the table. But regarding defense in depth with engineering assets, etc., you can't have a Maginot Line. You just can't, and because that would put pressure on Belarus. They'd have to be the front that they start any advance to outflank the Ukrainians. You could argue, right? I think the point that we miss by saying that yes, the Europeans can pull together and substitute for the United States is that it's not in the interest of the United States that they do that. The United States is playing against Ukraine at this point, and that's a big deal. So it's not just Hungary and Slovakia that are on the side of Russia. There's a deep concern that you don't want to alienate the United States, and they're worried about Trump. And yes, it's true that the new guy in Germany, Meitz, I think, Meitz, whatever his name is definitely more bellicose towards Russia, and quite willing to sever the ties with the United States, it seems. But that's maybe Starmer might go along with that to a point, but he's playing a delicate game too. And France being the third way, yeah, they'll do it, but they've only got a limited ability, So there's a problem as far as nukes. Absolutely. The Brits are absolutely totally dependent upon the United States for their tridents. And, what can France do? If you're going to be a player at this table, you need to have unity, but you need to have the requisite military, and they don't at the moment. Now they're working towards it, maybe. So I from the point of view of what is about to happen in the next few weeks, and I've said crap like this before, but I'm only going by what seems to be the rationale of the United States at this point. They do not want Ukraine to succeed on the battlefield. And so they will, if need be, put their thumbs on whatever the Brits might do or anybody else and say enough already. So I think the best result from Trump's point of view is a collapse of the Ukrainian army. And I'm totally behind Ukraine, always was, and I detest anybody who's pro, the other way, actually. And I really cannot understand that. But Jim is right about the Manchurian Candidate thing. It's not just in the United States; they're all over Europe too. And this is the success, absolute success of GRU and FSB. I mean, give them credit where credit is due. They've done a fantastic job. really fantastic job. And in terms of KGB, hats off to them. KGB would say, you've done a good job since you changed our name to FSB.
Right. Yeah.
It's the same manuals, the same techniques. Actually goes back to Okrana, by the way.
Yeah.
Even before. It's clever stuff, and they're winning that game. No question about it. They're winning that game. And so, I would want to know a little bit more solid information about the Chinese and North Korean involvement at the moment. We hear here and there that North Koreans are reappearing, not reappearing. What are they? Are they? If they come in big, substantial numbers, all this stuff that's been going where they're doing penny packet attacks. That's very typical of the Soviets in the Second World War. Penny packets all across the front, and then boom. The mass, front sort of attacks. And this shifting of balance is very, very hard to handle from the point of view of the Ukrainians. But ultimately, I think this spring, I don't know if it needs to be in the spring because it needs to be as soon as possible from Trump's point of view. So I think he's pressuring Putin to get this thing done. So I think it will be sometime in May. Okay, that's what I predict. Around about May 9th,
right,
when he will be standing next to Putin on at the May Day parade. So,
right.
and that'll be.
I mean, that's actually been suggested.
Really?
I know.
Yeah, by many. Yeah.
May 9th. Yeah, it should be May 9th. I think the offensive will take place May 9th, and it should go according to plan from Trump and Putin's point of view.
Oh.
It's sad, but that's the realpolitik of people like Musk. Musk comes from South Africa. He could not care less about the United States, for that matter. I don't believe, but that's me going off.
Well,
all right,
Frank,
Yeah.
and it's not like Ivan's not going to disappear. We're going to definitely pick Ivan's brain again and again as time goes on this one, because we know that this ain't going away. And I just want to let Alex have the last comment and question, and then we'll sort of, because Alex, we can keep Ivan on here for hours, and we don't want to do that. We want to spare Ivan so he can, but yes, definitely, Ivan. We'll probably want to return to this issue in a couple of weeks. But go on, then I'll bring Alex on.
Yeah.
Oh, go on, Alex. Okay.
One thing that I particularly noticed, the past, like, I guess it would be like 2-3 weeks, the Russians have had some success in finding and then hitting concentrations of drone operators.
Yeah.
In some cases, they track the drone back to where it's coming from, hit them. But again, I think that like a whole like drone training class, possibly including NATO trainers, get hit where they killed like 80, 100 of them. So I wonder about that. But second, again, you talk about kind of integrated Russian system, but of course the Red Army is known for is massive concentrations of artillery, firepower, and of course we haven't really. We haven't. At least you haven't seen like video. So I'm just wondering, you think that's just like a change in the nature of how modern artillery, or is that something about the lack of ability to coordinate truly massive amounts of firepower to just saturate an area? Thanks, Ivan.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, hey, I hope I got everything. Yeah, if I missed something, someone please just pipe up. I just want to make sure that I answer all the questions. So just kind of going around the horn, just to throw them all. So one, definitely, with to Jim's point about the saber rattling, and I think yes, indeed, that's exactly just what it is. It was one of Putin's tricks in his bag, that he could that called back in essence. It was like waving the bloody shirt, right? Calling back the specter and the fear of mutually assured destruction to all of those of us who lived through the Cold War and what that was like, and getting Biden and the West to self-deter, and it worked. I think, yeah, you're absolutely right that from the start they were looking for a military solution, a conventional military solution, to what they see as the problem in Ukraine. And to Frank's point, yeah, exactly. The Trump administration wants this to end. They are willing to engage by any means necessary to see because I mean Trump has all but said it the past few days, right? That the one that's difficult to work with is Zelensky. That he needs to make the concessions, that he needs to come to the table, and everything that's being done is being geared for that, to occur. Definitely, whether it's, I speculate. I mean, I don't know, but as far as the design of it, but definitely the Russians will take advantage of that. Then to again kind of go back, to kind of the point that Aaron's making is like, well, what's the point, right? We're just bashing a head against the wall. It's like, but if you could get a salient at a key part of the front, either one, you get you move the ball a little bit down the field, right, so to speak. But then two, given just the current circumstances, you could potentially, if you did put some extra weight behind it, like I said, there's indications that some of the reserve forces that Russia's been constituting these past few months are going to be employed somewhat in this manner come the springtime, and then maybe you could get some type of truly meaningful breakthrough. It could be that perfect storm. You get the closest thing we're going to see to a collapse, or who knows, maybe an actual collapse on some point of the front, and then you move within information sphere to play that up. Then to get finally the will to break with Ukrainians, and then you dictate terms. And considering that the Trump administration, the type of world that they see shaping and would like to shape, then yeah, that's getting Ukraine to acquiesce. And true enough, the other point Frank was making with as far as the intel sharing, it is this give and take, right? That I think you're correct in that. And what I mean by that is that Europe, again, it goes, the will is there, but they're not physically there, if that makes sense, right? They need time still to actually chart off this new path, but they're still irrevocably tied to the United States and dependent upon the United States for many things. And that's leverage then that, sure, the Trump administration can use to coerce, all geared toward getting Ukraine to bend whatever way they can so they can come to the table. This ends. They want it over, so that they can move on to what they feel their priorities are in reshaping America's security priorities more in line with in the sense of, yeah, the whole realpolitik, regional power construct into this brave new world that they seemingly want to charge ahead into. So definitely these next few weeks, these next 2-3 months are going to be they're going to be pivotal from that point of view, or from that standpoint. I don't think there's going to be necessarily something completely earth-shattering militarily occur in Ukraine. You never know. There could be. But I think, though, the perception of, right, which drives a narrative, which then puts tremendous political pressure where they're trying to put tremendous political pressure to get the result they want, is more apt to be successful than, say, a few months ago. and definitely a different course than what um, Biden took, or a Harris administration would have taken. But then I think those would have presented their own different hosts of sets of problems and challenges and conundrums around the same period of time. So I hope I caught everything. If I didn't, please let me know.
The question of Russian integration of artillery and
Oh, right,
large fires.
right, yeah. So I don't necessarily think it's. Oh, and then also too about China and North Korea. I'll address the artillery first and then that. I don't think it's necessarily either a lack of capability. I think it's potentially a shift in how they see the sequence go, right? Because like I said, they've over the past year they've developed this, or they're integrating the fires piece with the electromagnetic and cyber piece, and almost viewing that as a form of fires. Um, and those so where they saturate on that level first is in the concept almost the same as if you're just pulling a whole bunch of lanyards, and you had tubes hub to hub like 80 years ago. And then that's then followed up with the combination of indirect with something like fabs and so forth and FPVs. It's I think just un to what maybe you mentioned, a evolution of, not so much a replacement of, if that makes sense. I just think that they are still experimenting on ways on how to maximize all of these different assets in concert with one another and synchronizing them for the best maximum effect, both offensive and defensively. As when it comes to the North Koreans and China, actually there was um, a story a few days ago. I can't remember which day it was. It was late last week, or just this past week, of the Chinese potentially being interested or in talks
That was
of.
Newsweek. That was Newsweek.
It was okay. Okay, yeah, I couldn't quite remember the source. To deploy something or some type of troop package or something. It wasn't. There's not too clear to Eastern Ukraine to get the same type of experience as the North Koreans. The North Koreans do have 4 brigades in Kursk. They all come from the 11th Corps, the Storm Corps. It's one of the better, and this is a relative term for North Korea, but it is one of their better equipped and fed and trained units. It is a unit that's on that's forward, right, on the MZ. So far, they've only made they're in the composition is essentially 3. I believe it's like it's 3 mech infantry and 1 soft. When you think soft, think Spetsnaz. And so they're maintaining. So far, it's just it seems like they're just maintaining the 12,000 troop level. I know there was suggestions it could go higher, potentially as much as 100,000, but not sure how valid that is. The North Koreans never went anywhere. There was the odd source saying, "Oh, they're off the line." No, they were just part of. They were just doing troop rotations, just like any other Russian unit does. Just due to the casualties that they took in December, early January, or throughout January, they just rotated off the line to be reconstituted with new replacements that came in, and then like 2 weeks passed, which is the typical time for reconstitution. So they haven't gone anywhere. But so far, it seems that they're just maintaining the 12,000 cap. Of course, that's not to say that's permanent. That could definitely change. It would seem, at least from the one story, right, that the Chinese may want to gain some type of practical experience, maybe seeing some sort of benefit that the North Koreans have been getting out these past several months, that they want to then gain as well. And the only way you gain it, right, is being on the ground. So I think, and then also too, it comes into when anyone kind of like smells the end of something, especially the end of a war. There's last, just like, hey, it's your last chance to get in on whatever it is that you want to get in on. So there might be some of that going on, thinking, hey, this is the last. Maybe this thing ends 6 months. Their last bit of chance to get something, even if it's just some observers on the ground, so that way then they can go back and improve their own the command and control or battle staff functions, or whatever it is they're seeking to try to improve upon for the PLA, as they look to have it be more of an active instrument in wielding, the CCP's national or foreign policy, especially when it comes to Taiwan. And just looking at the rhetoric that's been coming out from China about Taiwan the past couple of weeks.
Yeah, interesting that you mentioned the North Koreans because there's evidence that they've sent tubular and MLRS battalions also, which is interesting. And again, this is a subject we want to return to again. And so, of course, it's great to hear Ivan's well-informed analysis about this. I know we're all in depth for hearing him go through this in great detail. And I know we could listen to him for another 2 hours and ask him questions, but we'll do that another time. I also wanted to announce that on Wednesday, we're going to do a noisy reality event with a visiting scholar at Princeton University who'll be talking about the Syrian revolution. And he will be talking about it turns out he's a scholar of Arab constitutionalism, which I was on the phone with Gary Sick earlier, and Gary said, I don't know about that, because he tends to be cynical about Arab constitutionalism. But we'll see how that is. And that is Zaid Ali Ali. And then next Sunday at 1 o'clock, we'll have James Ketterer, who teaches at Bard. James was a fellow in Egypt. He ran a program in Egypt for quite a long time. He also was a member of the National Security Council at one point on the Middle East. So we're going to talk about the latest developments in the Middle East, which, of course, who knows? It'll be just as dynamic as talking about this. But Ivan, I want to thank you so much. It was so great to hear you, and we look forward to hearing you again because, we can't get enough of this.
Well, definitely thank you for having me, and definitely enjoyed the discussion anytime.
All right, great. And you guys take it easy. Have a great Sunday.